Again, I really want to thank you for having me here. And for the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about the interconnection between reading and writing and the hybrid practices. And these are sort of some thoughts and ideas that I have had together with a colleague called Katrine Melgaard. And it's kind of the kind of, like I mentioned, the prelude to the workshop that's going to be here later today. So this might be considered the sort of more theoretical access, the theory of the bones of this particular project, and then the workshop's going to be a bit more sort of hands-on ideas. So I'm going to be talking about hybrid creatures, and not least this sort of fraught relationship between created and creator, in the context of looking at writing, especially scholarly writing and academic writing, and some of the issues that may appear when we try to write and we end up having some issues and concerns in the writing process. And from a very sort of personal perspective, this is something that I've been working with since I have a tendency to be an anxious writer. I do get incredibly anxious. I have a tendency to writer's block. I have a tendency to procrastination. I will procrastinate endlessly. I will sit down and look at this, and I will immediately go to YouTube and just look at videos with parrots. I know a lot about parrots at this point, and they're incredibly cute, but I have not done a lot of writing. So this is kind of something that I've been looking at, and I've been teaching creative writing, and I've been teaching academic writing, and I have kind of been giving a lot of supposedly good advice to other people, and I just cannot do it myself for whatever reason. So something that we're working with, especially with Katrine, my colleague, and with my colleagues at Edith's Lab at IT University, is perhaps to rethink our relationship with writing and rethink our relationship, not least with academic writing, with the text itself. Is it possible to think of it as a monster, as kind of a monstrous practice? This can, of course, be a bit more intimidating than, you know, anxiety reducing, thinking of your text as a monster, but it may also make it possible to us to think about writing as a vulnerable process that is incredibly transgressive, that is hybrid in its connections between the reader and the writer and the text, those who are yet to read it and those who have somehow informed the writing. So obviously this is not a perfect solution, and it's still in the early days, and I really would love to hear your thoughts and ideas afterwards if you have your own theories about writing, and sometimes the anxieties and the pains of writing, as much as the pleasures, obviously, can also be incredibly rewarding. So before I start delving into what might hybrid writing look like in a hybrid text, I would first like to mention that when I say hybrid text, I'm not thinking about the genre itself. There is a hybrid text genre in which people are looking at ways of doing text differently, involving different kind of aesthetics, different kind of genres. So lots of what I'm saying here, other people have said, other people have practiced as well. So nothing particularly new in that sense. But when I talk about hybrid text, I'm not talking about the genre, I'm talking about the figure of the hybrid, and more of a conceptual understanding of hybridity. Can we, through that lens and through that companionship with the hybrid, perhaps rethink and reimagine the writing process? But before I kind of move on to what might hybrid writing look like, I would like to just say a few words about what traditional scholarly academic writing might look like. Perhaps you already know about this text by Steve Chapin, Pomp and Circumstance, Robert Boyle's Literary Technologies. It's a brilliant text in which Chapin delves into the works of the natural scientists, Robert Boyle's works, especially in the 1650s and 1660s. Now, Robert Boyle was, as I mentioned, a natural philosopher. He was a scientist. He was a nobleman, had lots of money. One of the things he had money for was his own laboratory. Okay, here we go. I'm going to admit people. Excellent, I haven't done this before. Okay, so Robert Boyle had lots of money. Basically, he could set up his own laboratory. He could do his own experiments in this laboratory. And he started kind of looking into what are the metrics and the systems for understanding proper conduct, especially when it came to objectivity. What is proper research objectivity, for example? And he came to this conclusion: there are some parts of the world, some aspects of natural reality that are simply matters of fact. That was the concept he came up with, matters of fact. It's simply how the world is. That's universal fact. It's the truth. You can find it out through experiments in your laboratory, obviously, and then you can establish whether something is a matter of fact. The problem is obviously that anybody then could, if they had the money to set up a laboratory, they could say, I have done this particular experiment, I have come up with a matter of fact, it's the truth. But if nobody else has seen it, then that's really easy to make that claim. So Robert Boyle's argument at this point in time was that in order for something to become a matter of fact, it has to be witnessed by a group of peers and by a community. So Steve Shapen's argument is that at this point in time, community and communication are related, not just etymologically, but also when it comes to an understanding of what is good and proper research practices, and how does something move into the realm of a matter of fact and truthful knowledge. So Boyle basically needed lots of people, lots of his peers, of his community, to look at his experiment and see, yes, what you're doing is actually proving that this is a matter of fact. But how do you do that in kind of a practical way? How do you invite people into your laboratory and say, welcome, let's have a look, let's do this experiment together? It's just not feasible. So he had to find another way for people to witness his works. And this is what Steve Shapen calls virtual witnessing, the possibility of witnessing something that has happened far away or in the past. And it had to be done through writing. So Boyle started looking into using writing as a technology for making this kind of virtual witnessing possible. This also meant that there were certain aspects of writing that had to be in place. First of all, it had to come from the position of modesty. And if any of you are Haraway readers, you will have already met this concept of the modest witness. The idea of the scientist as a modest, detached, distant person who simply views the world as is, and then comes back to his desk, writes it all down and puts it out there into the world for other modest witnesses to virtually witness that, yes, this is true, this is a matter of fact. I accept the description of your experiment and that this then makes what you are claiming true. In order to be properly modest, you have to write in a particular way. You couldn't just write in a kind of poetic way or like a flourishing creative way. You had to write in a way that showed the bare, naked truth of the world. So this is kind of the manual that Robert Boyle, to some extent, ended up creating as an implied way of doing this kind of academic writing. You had to not assert more than what you can prove. So basically, whenever you write, when you ask people to witness something, you can only ask them to witness something that you can actually prove. The writing style itself has to be functional. It has to be plain, puritanical, unadorned. It could be convoluted if you liked. The style cannot be florid. It must represent reality in its purest, most naked form. So this is again an idea that there is a world out there that is static, universal, that you can figure out through your experiments, and then you can write about it at your desk afterwards in a plain, puritanical, unadorned way, send it out into the world, have people witness it and say, yes, truly, this is actually how it is. If you are to approach your writing in a confident mode, be aware that you can only do so when you talk about matters of facts. Not when you talk about theories, not when you talk about speculations. Only when you actually have proof that something is a matter of fact, you can confidently talk about it as this is actually true. Now finally, the truly modest scientist and the truly modest witness never mentions to mention failed experiments. This is part of your modesty, that you can acknowledge that something has gone wrong, obviously, so that people will believe you when you then explain your success. So here is a very particular way of writing that is somehow connected to an understanding of the world as static, universal, out there to be described in a pure, naked form that it will eventually make your readers into virtual witnesses of what you're doing. And this obviously stands in a kind of a contrast to any other kinds of other ways of writing, for example, creative writing. So you have, on the one hand, you have academic writing, which is about content more than the form, which doesn't mean that academic writing is not about the form. We all have been probably struggling with academic form. There's an idea of you have to build it up with the introduction, you have to present your case, you have to present your data, you have to do things in a certain way and then discuss, conclude, and so on and so forth. So there's a form, but the content is sort of the important part, and the form becomes the vehicle of the content. The idea that form and content can to some extent be viewed as separate. It describes what exists and what happens, and it does not embellish, and this points to an understanding of objectivity. I simply describe what I see as I see it. Whereas creative writing is constructed then as the opposite. It's about form as much as it's about content. It makes things up and embellishes, it's subjective. So it's kind of creation, it's a processual creation of different ways of writing that are somehow more or less connected to the world as it properly and actually is. This is kind of what's happening at this point. Obviously, not everybody could be a modest witness. If you read Haraway, this does not come as a surprise to you. When Boyle was inviting people into his lab in a virtual setting, he was not inviting just anybody. It was a highly gendered, highly racialized, highly classed who could be considered. Oh, I think somebody has an open mic. Thanks. Excellent. Not everybody could become a modest witness, whether you were a scientist or you were a reader. You had to be a specific race, age, class in order to be considered properly modest and properly capable of distancing yourself from what you're looking at. And here from this really wonderful picture and painting really kind of shows it, who can be considered capable of witnessing, who has to avert their eyes because their emotions sort of take over. Or they will be looking at the dying bird with so much compassion that they cannot write about it in an objective, distanced way. It will become from a position of subjectivity, of pain, of emotion. Let's see here. Now, all of this may still ring true to you. This understanding of how you write properly, how you write from a distance, how you write for a community, and that is also Chapin's argument that community writing is an inherent part of this understanding of academic objective writing, that you write for a reviewer, you write for a peer reviewer, you write for your community. So your community is invited into your writing already before actually you start writing. You have the eyes of your community on you. To this day, obviously, we still have this when it comes to the peer review process. And if any of you have already, put out your writing, you have tried to get reviewers write back to you, there is this legendary or mythological creature of reviewer number 2, who is the one that always has completely unrealistic expectations to what you should do, what kind of standards you should measure up to in order to be recognizably academic and recognizably objective. So reviewer 2 is sort of the monster that really says, this is horrible, this is bad. You should have written more about things that I care about. Why did you not quote me? That's kind of the reviewer number 2. So it's at the very opposite, long end of the scale here. That still points to the fact that there are standards within each and every discipline for what is recognizably academic, what is recognizably objective, what can even be understood and recognized as knowledge. And considering how the modest witness, both as a scientist and as a reader of other people's science, is so highly gendered, racialized, classed, so on and so forth, you will find a lot of critiques of also contemporary peer reviewing systems, especially within feminist theory, decolonial theory, queer theory, so on. Looking at what are the standards for what is recognizably objective, what is recognizably knowledge that is worthy of review, that is worthy of being taken into consideration, and what does it mean that we have a very specific understanding of academic language if sometimes the content does not really work well with that particular way of writing? Does it mean that some people are automatically pulled into the margins and not considered proper academics simply because they are not recognizable within this way of writing? So a lot of critiques have been raised, should be, about how scholarly academic writing is understood as distant, dispassionate, bounded, simply describing a world that is out there, or running the risk of not being recognized as proper knowledge, proper objective science and fact. Now, obviously, as Chapin also touches upon in his text, there is kind of a quite wonderful paradox to this idea of the distance is passionate, bounded writing. Something that you do after you have proved your matters of fact. You sit by your desk, you put all of these little things together that you have done, you write them down in a dispassionate but detailed way, so that other people can see what you have done and why you have concluded what you have concluded. They can read it, they can say, yes, that's how it is. But everything is happening at a distance. That's kind of the idea. Yet, as Chapin talks about, the community, the necessity of community of the witness, means that this way of writing is actually not particularly bounded. You have invited these people into your head, into your writing, into your way of doing scholarly work, even before they have read anything you have done. So in many ways, you are not a bounded subject when you do research. You're not a bounded subject when you start writing. You are actually sitting in a bit of a room filled with people looking at what you're about to do and filling up this supposed gap of the blank page. So in many ways, it's already quite a hybrid connection to be writing, scholarly writing, because you're writing to and with and from your peers. So what might it mean to acknowledge these connections, perhaps through the figure of the hybrid? What might a hybrid writing look like if, instead of trying to cover up how writing is in many ways dependent on our communities, on our peers, both on voices and text that are by now, that might be in the past, but also voices, text, eyes that are yet to come, that sit with you by the desk as you start writing. Might there be a way to acknowledge this vulnerable position, of acknowledging this multiplicity, or this hybrid connection, in ways that could perhaps make writing less anxiety-inducing? Who knows? But I would suggest that there might be a way to think about writing as hybrid. And I would like to suggest doing so through a particular story. And this is from a very, this is from my perspective, and I have to apologize in advance to anybody who knows just a tiny bit about what I do. I always tend to write about and talk about this story. So in this way, I am perhaps myself haunted or cursed by this story. It keeps returning. And perhaps you already know it even just as is. But it's a story about the curious case of smart JPEG. I think it's a brilliant story. I've been talking about it forever. I'll probably be talking about it again forever. But to me, this is, though it's not an article, it's not a traditional academic paper, it's an urban legend that does in many ways engage with some of the anxieties at stake in this sort of open hybrid way of writing that is kind of inherent to scholarly writing, where you really do need to sit down with your peers already before they're reading what you have read. The curious case of smart JPEG, in case you don't know it, is an urban legend, started circulating around 2007, 2008. It tells the story of one of our colleagues, Mr. L, who is a college student. He's an academic who wants to write a paper. He might also want to write a few pieces of fiction, but primarily he wants to write an academic article on a paper. And he wants to do it on the case of smart JPEG, which is an urban legend within an urban legend. The story goes that in the 1990s, smart JPEG started circulating as kind of an attachment to either to emails, or you could find it as a link. And the link would, for example, say something along the lines of, "Smile, Jesus loves you." Or you would get an email sent to you that had an attachment that said smile.jpg. And if you open the attachment, if you click the link, you'll see an image of a dog-like creature, for lack of a better word, with glowing eyes and a broad grin that is too broad for a dog, and with human-like teeth. And from the darkness behind it, a hand is reaching out as if to grab you and pull you into the image. At night, this dog, who is called Smile Dog, will come to you and say, spread the word. By this, it means show my picture to somebody else and I will leave you alone, or so it promises. Anyway. Now, Mr. L is interested in finding out who have actually seen this JPEG, and if it's truly true, if it is a matter of fact. Can he prove to some extent that this is a matter of fact? And he finds a woman called Mary E, who has been living with Smile Dog for 15 years because she refuses to show its picture to somebody else. And she says, stop while you are still whole. Meaning, stop so that you don't see this image, so that you don't break apart, so it doesn't infect you, contaminate you, so you don't have to live with this creature in your mind for the rest of your life like I had to do. And obviously Mr. L does not stop. He carries on, soldiers through, finally gets an email saying, I saw that you're interested in Smart JPEG, I have attached it, it's not as bad as people say. Just spreading the word, have a look. And he kind of considers what to do, because what if it's authentic? What if it is truly, the actual Smart JPEG? What would he do? Would he be ethical and moral enough to not show the image to somebody else? Would he live forever with Smart JPEG like Mary E did? Or would he pass it on to somebody else? Because as he ponders, he's an academic, he's in a perfect position to pass on this curse. He just has to write an article, and at the very end of the article, he could add this as data. And then everybody who read the article, anybody who took interest, would become cursed by Smart JPEG. And he kind of wonders if he would be, callous enough to do this. And obviously, as we keep reading, we find out that yes, he would be callous enough to do it. So at the end of his article, this is what we see. The image of Smart JPEG, and now we are all cursed. And tonight this dog is going to come to us and it's going to say, spread the word. And it's up to you whether you want to spread it or not. And you have to consider what is the ethical response here. Now, to me, the urban legend of this, the curious case of Smart JPEG, is interesting in various ways. I think it is in many ways a story about academic writing. It's a story about some anxieties connected to academic writing and to scholarly writing as something that is not in complete and utter opposite to poetic writing, to fiction writing. It's something that is transgressive. It's something that may contaminate you. It's something that may enter your head and never leave it. Or it's something that may not arrive in a way that you expected, because perhaps Smile Dog does not come to you tonight. Perhaps it doesn't come to you tomorrow, but perhaps it doesn't come to you in a few weeks, but who knows? Nobody really knows. Maybe it will come to you in a few years or on your dying bed. Nobody really knows. So there is this living with this openness, this opening of a window, this opening of an area of potential and possibility where you live with the specters of what you read, where they haunt you, where they follow you, where they keep you company. And obviously, the curious case of Smart JPEG is not itself an academic paper. It would not pass the standards for the peer review. Peer review number 2 would be furious. But it is a story that points to some of the anxieties about academic writing, about doing ethnographic field work, about going into the field, interviewing other people, collecting data. It's a story about anxieties, about trying to keep up a boundary between researcher and research object, about keeping up a boundary between reader and the written, about between the text and between that which you write. The text itself is monstrous. It is a hybrid. It's a dog with a human-like grin. It's a hand free of a body. It's something that is not whole. And because it's not whole, because you are not whole, because you are relying on the community in order to write, you can become contaminated. It can attach itself to you. You can attach itself to it. So hybrid connections, hybrid writing may be trying to look at the text as monstrous to some extent. And in this way, the blank page is never empty. It's filled with the voices, with the eyes of your readers yet to come, with a community that is both making it possible for you to write, whether these are the voices of academics you have been reading so far, people who have inspired you, who have made you sad, who made you angry, the idea of the readers who are yet to come, who will eventually have to read what you are writing at this point. So it's filled with voices and eyes. It's a hybrid connection in many ways that connects the past and the future. So perhaps acknowledging this place as filled with specters, as haunted by the monster, as haunted by hybrid connection, could be a way to start thinking about writing as something that can be difficult, vulnerable, transgressive, and in its transgressions it can be pleasurable, obviously, but it can also be incredibly hurtful and difficult to work with. And moving into sort of the final part of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the workshop that will happen later today, the Writing Monsters workshop, because I was talking to my colleague Katrine Melgaard about writing differently, about vulnerabilities in writing, about this constant gaze of the peer reviewer, of the community that you will have to live up to, because you constantly have to consider, is this recognizably academic, the research that I'm doing? Would others recognize this as truthful, as knowledge? And she's been having a lot of the same considerations. We have both tried meeting peer reviewers who did not recognize what we did as properly academic, and that they had to change the standards in order to include it, or otherwise simply had to reject it. So we want to look at writing as a monstrous practice, as looking at the text itself as a monster filled with hybrid connections. So we set up the Writing Monsters workshop with Ethos Lab at IT University, and Ethos Lab is a place where they experiment with different ways of doing methods and methodologies, different ways of producing knowledge, different ways of being a researcher, and a kind of living with your research projects. And what we started out to do was to ask people to bring a text that they felt anxious about, that they felt uncomfortable with, that they found difficult to write and to finish. And we did a round where everybody had to start out by talking to their text, and we asked them, begin with the words, "you are." And slowly this changed, and people started saying, instead of "you are," they started by saying, kind of acknowledging the text and saying, "hello text, you are." And they started writing, basically talking directly to the text as if it was a living being. Some other things they said were some of these things, like, "hello text, I had better plans for you. You could have had something interesting to say, something substantial to contribute with. Hello text, I definitely feel some guilt towards you. Hello text, you are ghosts that inhabit my laptop files, and I know you want to be written, otherwise I would not resurface you again and again. I have this lacking sense, oh, you are languishing, and this is my fault. Perhaps you were considered not quite academic enough for some reason, too personal." And also points of afterwards, after the workshop, sometimes people had these experiences of, for example, suddenly writing does not feel as lonely, and now I feel instead that my text is vulnerable. If it is lonely, it is simply waiting for others. So we wanted to experiment with the community part of writing, which is obviously so inherent to academic writing and other kinds of writing just in general, but not least in academic writing. But we wanted it to be a different way of community, and a different way of being together, a different way of reading each other's text and incorporating them into your own work. So after this, we asked people to cut up their texts into bits and pieces and give bits of these texts to some of their colleagues. And by using these words and sentences of other people's work, create a hybrid text where they try to rewrite the text they came with, but using only the words of others and the new words that they could write inspired by these words. So creating kind of a hybrid text from others, taking the gift that others were giving, but also giving back other pieces of text to see if they could go forth and do something productive or interesting or fascinating for others. So we wanted to really look into this idea of community more as a sense of generosity and sharing and hybrid connections, more than perhaps the modest witnessing, keeping things at a distance, and trying to be bounded, wanted to open this up and really explore these hybrid connections. So, to kind of sum things up, slowly moving towards the end, I would end on the note of, for example, asking questions when it comes to what could a hybrid way of understanding writing be. Could, for example, be asking questions such as, who keeps you company when you write? Who are you writing for? Who is haunting you as you write, whether when you are feeling good about writing or when you feel anxious about writing? Is somebody keeping you company right now? Is somebody already judging you, looking at you, telling you, whispering in your ear about what you do? But also, whose company makes it possible for you to write? Is it people you already read? Is it past theorists? Is it supervisors? Is it teachers? Is it colleagues? Is it somebody you are imagining will eventually at some point read what you are writing right now? So really acknowledge these different kinds of connections, this multiplicity in writing, and that you're not alone in writing, which can both be obviously perhaps anxiety inducing, but may also help to calm the anxiety sometimes, to think that we are not alone and we are connected across past and future and through our communities. And that these communities are far from always human. They are also a community you create with text, both present, future, and past. So, taking very easy advice and stopping soon, wrapping up saying that the argument I was trying to make here is obviously you are never whole. You are never this truly modest witness who is completely distanced from everything. Writing could be understood as this hybrid connection where you are in constant company with the ghostly voices of various kinds of monsters, and you are yourself creating a monster as you write that you will then release onto the world to do what it pleases, basically. And perhaps thinking of writing as this monstrous practice, as this hybrid practice, is a way to acknowledge the vulnerability inherent to the process, whether this makes it easier or perhaps more difficult to write. But this is all I have for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see some of you at the workshop, where we're going to move on into actually doing this hybrid way of writing. But for now, thank you so much. Just stop share here, yes.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I think people, when they have questions, have kind of two options. They can either kind of write them down in the chat, or they can kind of turn on their mic and ask question. So I'm going to use this opportunity to ask my question because I'm already holding the mic. So I found a lot of truth in what you've been saying, especially about this, the way your research kind of infects you and kind of changes you, right? And it's an often question that a comment that I get from other people, like how can you enjoy, I don't know, Guardians of the Galaxy, now that you know all that feminist theory and queer theory, like how can you enjoy, I don't know, Marvel Universe, right? And so there's this suggestion that I've been kind of broken by what I've been reading, and I can't really engage with culture or pop culture anymore, or in a way that is kind of pure without this academic baggage. And it's just a comment that I kind of understand this also from this perspective as a cultural studies scholar. But I want to actually ask, as you said that those transgressions that happen when you're writing, this kind of hybrid writing, that and the transgressions that come from that, they are often hurtful, but they can also be pleasurable. And I was kind of wondering about the pleasure part, like how can transgressions kind of become pleasurable for the writer? If you kind of thought about this, I would be grateful to learn more.
Yeah, well, I think to me, ultimately, writing is transgressive in the sense that you cannot write from a position of being alone. In that sense, it is always inevitably something that you do in the company of others. And I would imagine it obviously transgression is also part of, for example, theories of the erotic and of the erotic meeting, the loving encounter, where you perhaps are indeed reminded of how you can become part of others, how you can become part of something that's beyond you. So I think that transgressing boundaries is something that can be painful and hurtful, but that might also, you cannot perhaps also change as a person without these transgressions, without having the boundaries between self and other questioned. And sometimes it perhaps is in the encounter with the text that you realize potentially that things could be different, that I could be different, that we can view the world in a completely different way. And these little, to me at least, these little reminders that things could be completely and ultimately different, that can be part, like, you know, I'm already kind of part of some companionships that sometimes I'm a big fan of horror myself. And what I love about the horror genre is these little moments of realization that the world is bigger than I can possibly ever imagine and understand. And that is both terrifying, but it can also be exciting to think that everything has a plan, whether it's the kitchen sink or it's the neighbors. So I think there can be pleasures in this knowledge of what is perhaps these bodily experiences of transgression, as much as they can be painful, because all kind of change and all kind of transgression can be obviously painful. But I think this is also so incredibly subjective, and people may have completely different understandings of this, obviously. Yeah, you say you have reflections and questions. Okay, yeah.
Okay,
Nice,
so hello. First of all, I would like to say thank you for your really interesting lecture and presentation, which is actually really close to my practice, being honest, because I used to work with autoethnography. So your reflections, your way of describing of your process of writing is really close to my work, but. The first thing which came to my mind when I've been hearing you is like a Marilyn Strathern description of ethnographic moment, and it's like close to this point about transgression, I guess, because it's like moving from the process of experiencing something in the field work to the process of writing. We have two processes, and my question for you is if you think and if you feel as a writer that this is a kind of one process being maybe divided in like different stages, or we can say about totally different processes. And what is also meaningful and it's present in your reflection is like this of course, new materialism perspective. I'm hearing also a lot like common points with Hawaiian way of thinking about being many. And also what came to my mind is this including in the process of writing, not just a writer, but everything and everybody being around in the moment of, you know, gaining data, but also in the moment of writing and also in the moment of reading. So it's like kind of network being increasingly broader because we have, yeah, a lot of stages of this this creative process. And I'm a PhD student at Polish Academia, and I know your university, I mean your Linköping University, and it's really great and open for new humanities. But what is your perspective in general? I mean the development of academia in this this movement into hybrid form. Because from my perspective, the process of development, I mean our academic narration and also the process of academic writing is a bit delayed when we are confronting it with the general development of technologies and you know the development of our culture. So what do you think? Do we have chances to transform ourselves in this hybrid version pretty fast, or we still have a lot of things to do? And if we are having like problems, what is the reason of these problems in general? So yeah, I think it's a bunch of different things. So sorry for a mess, but I found your talk really like inspiring, and it opened in my mind a lot of like gates. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these questions and for these comments. So I'll try to see if I can respond to them in a meaningful way. So the first question, as I remember, was that it was about the writing process and whether it was split into different stages, and whether that was my experience as well. And I definitely think so. I think that there are different ways that you can use writing as a process and as a method, especially when it comes to, for example, the early days of you're doing your research, where you can spend a lot of time doing these sort of brainstorms, do a lot of free writing, using writing to find out what you even want to write about. And that is some of the concerns I have with the way that academic writing is traditionally taught at universities, that something that comes after you have done all your fieldwork, after you have collected all your data, all of your theories, then you can sit down by your desk and write it all together. And my experience is, for some people, obviously this works, but for others, like me, it's when I start writing that I start understanding what I want to say, that I start even getting an idea about what is my argument. And writing changes how I think about my research. You cannot really kind of separate form and content when it comes to writing for me. So I would suggest always that writing is incorporated as early as possible in a research project, that it's used to do these brainstorms, it's used to find out what do I even want to say, it's especially used when we experience roadblocks, like what do I want to say about this, why am I even attracted to this particular way of doing research, what is it that it's doing for me, and simply sit down and write about it without having the pressure of thinking this is something that will eventually turn into an article or a paper or something like that. And then obviously there's the later stages where you'll have to put things together, you'll have to think less in a broadening way of using writing, where it has to generate ideas, and more into it has to generate a structure. Now I have to settle on a given structure, I have to start figuring out how is it built up, and then I have to do a tiny bit of writing, perhaps every day, like 20 minutes or 30 minutes, get this thing done. While at the same time, I would say acknowledging that writing is never done. Whenever we finish a paper, whenever we finish an article, it's just not finished. We can always polish more, there's always more we want to say, we are always bringing it into our next work. So, and it will also in the meeting with the reader take on more. The reader's interpretation of the writing always opens it up in new ways. So thinking of writing as eternally a process, even when we have finished it, even when the peer reviewers have gone, okay, let's publish this thing, still actually in development. And that can, to me at least, sometimes be a kind thought, because then it doesn't have to be perfect when I hand it in, because nothing's ever perfect. So I would agree with you that there are different stages in the process of writing. I really agree with you on that. And then I believe that the second question was about this sort of movement towards doing hybrid writing, or doing writing differently, or doing academic writing differently. And I think there is a lot going on these days, especially when it comes to online publishing, to open publishing, that makes it possible to perhaps to do the peer review process differently, to do the publishing process differently. But I also think that there is a lot of politics and ethics going on here that's problematic, in the sense of, for example, if you want to publish in the high-ranking journals, the ones that really gives you lots of credit, you will have to be kind of recognizable in certain ways. You have, and this really makes it impossible for those who do research that cannot be written in a traditional way, how to make it possible then to publish in these more standardized thinking, big sort of dinosaur places, where you really get a lot of weight, but you also get a lot of a lack of new thought and new ways of doing knowledge. So it is incredibly political. It means a lot of people are just not recognized as properly academic or properly objective. And I think it's slowly changing, but it is really slow And we do have a lot of really exciting work done by great scholars working on how can we think differently about writing and reading and what it means to write in a way that is recognizably objective and is to a high scholarly standard. So it's an interesting field, I think, and I hope that we will see a lot of changes soon. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Did this somehow respond to some of your questions?
Yeah, I just asked too many questions at the same time. So thank you very much. I'm glad that you respond for almost for everything.
Thank you so much. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please do feel free. Oh yeah. Okay. And yes, I got some really great points in the chat. Yeah. And I also want to point out that this, when it comes to hybrid writing, I do make hybrid writing both obviously as a way that you can write the text and you can do a hybrid text, but also I see it as a method. It's a way of writing with your community. So you can actually use hybrid writing, for example, in the sense of collage writing, or in the sense of thinking about the ways of writing more as a process and as a method than necessarily as a final form. So they can look hybrid at the end, but sometimes you can do an incredibly straight-laced traditional article using hybrid writing simply to get the juices flowing and simply to get started on a text that, for example, has been bugging you for a long time, trying to think of it as a monster, trying to acknowledge that it's vulnerable, trying to acknowledge it as something that's a process, as something that's connected to others. And through these processes and cutting things up potentially and putting things together in new ways, it can be possible to do an incredibly traditional article, but it's a way to sometimes get of being anxious in the company of your text and reconnect with your text.
Mm-hmm. So if I may kind of maybe ask a follow-up question to what Carolina has commented. So I just want to say that I was kind of thinking about what Carolina mentioned at the end of her comment, that that there might be this feeling that humanities in many places, not everywhere, but in many places, are kind of lagging behind technologies, right? Kind of technologies not necessarily understood as STEM technologies, but also in the sense of, I don't know, kind of more experimental ways of approaching research, right? And I was thinking about diffractive reading here, and kind of Karen Barat's onto epistemology, that it's a kind of I would say framework of thinking about doing research, right? Doing research that kind of requires you to think outside of the mold, outside of the box. It's a cliche, but well, it is. But then, and it's quite popular and it's quite, I would say, prestigious, right, to use this at this moment, I'd say. But at the same time, people want you to write, again, this kind of straight-laced traditional research paper using diffraction, which is all about not being straight-laced and being experimental and messing up this triad: researcher, research object, and the tools you're using. So I guess I think there is no question here. Probably just a comment that that I completely agree. Right, that you know, politics and ethics. Right, that it's we are so enmeshed in all of that, right? And sometimes even when we want to do hybrid writing, we are kind of told, no, you can't, right? You have to stay with this kind of traditional mold because that's recognized as knowledge, that's recognized as science, that's recognized as peer review and as academic writing, and what you're proposing is not. So it's that's it. That was just the kind of, you know, comment that I wanted to get out. Thank you so much for kind of, you know, answering my question and of course Karina's questions as well. And I think maybe more people are interested in asking questions, so maybe I'll just shut up.
and also no pressure. I mean, if you don't have any questions, I mean, that's completely fair as well.
Yeah, I think we don't have to kind of force anyone into asking questions. I think I think the general...
can definitely add to what you were saying, and yes, it's such a good point about how writing differently is something that is acceptable as a subject, or as like something you can write about as a content, but actually doing it as a practice, or doing it as a indeed something that's performative, something you have to show, not just in the content of what you're writing, but actually also in the form, can be really difficult. And it is also an honest problem, because if you do open up to different ways of writing, if you do open up to different ways of doing academic structurings, it does create some issues when it comes to peer review. And it does really sometimes, also as a peer reviewer, you can sit and you can look at something and it's so strange and it's so other. It's not something that you have perhaps a lot of knowledge of. And how do you even then give feedback to something? And how do you look into its research practices if it's done in a very experimental way? So there are these issues with how the whole system of the academic community is built up, and the whole community of peer reviewing. How is it done? By whom is it done? Even those who might actually be open to weirdness is also like asking these questions. But then, how do I give this a proper peer review? So it is. It's really it's difficult looking for these ways of doing things differently. So that's the question from Carolina. What about the personal perspective? Why academia is still so afraid of writing? I think. I also think, I don't know how your experience is with this, Carolina. I think this also is very connected to what discipline you're from and what where you're writing to. I think I'm speaking from a feminist perspective and a kind of gender studies perspective, where is much more, acknowledged as something that you can do. And then as you move into other areas of expertise, obviously, and it's something that I also see with some of the students I meet from different kind of disciplines, then the I becomes unacademic, it becomes subjective, it becomes not based on facts, it becomes based on your personal feelings, and therefore less worthy of acknowledgement. So I do think that that's worthy of critique, not least since, as I mentioned also in this paper, that is highly gendered in many ways. What does it mean when you speak from personal position, when you speak from your experiences with your relationship with what research you do? If you include things like emotions, feelings, experiences on a visual level. So it's a good question about this fear of the I, or the concerns about the objectivity of the I. I don't know if you have yourself some thoughts on this.
I have a question. First of all, it's so nice to see someone from Copenhagen give a lecture. It's so refreshing. I really miss Copenhagen sometimes.
Copenhagen, though.
Yes, I visited, but I was wondering if you see, I know it's a very simple question, but I'm just like trying to understand what you're saying. Is hybrid writing a technique or an approach, or would you say all writing is hybrid and it's just not being, let's say, acknowledged in the process of academic writing as it is understood and practiced today?
Yeah, no, that's a really crucial question. And my argument would be exactly that writing, the imaginary of writing is something that happens separate from the research object, separate from the research, almost separate from the reader. That is kind of how we are taught, traditionally speaking, writing in a scholarly setting. It's something you do at the end when you have collected all your data. You can sort of do it as a neat little package of communication at the end. But as for example, this going through of the the community aspect of writing really shows that the community is an inherent part of your writing process at the beginning, at the very end, throughout. I would also, since I'm a Derrida I read a lot of Derrida, I kind of like Derrida's theories. He's arguing also.
What was that?
Derrida.
Oh, yes.
Excellent. Because his argument is obviously that language is haunted and that it is older than we are. That the whole reason that we can talk in this moment, have this conversation, is because people before us have repeated these questions. The dead have been talking this language, and because they have repeated it and talked and taught it to others, we can say it. And it also means that language will be here after we are gone, basically. It's ghostly in that sense. It's beyond us. So language communication is already incredibly hybrid. It's moving and drawing connections from the past to the present to the future. When we sit and write, we sit and write because we imagine an other who will eventually read it, even if it's just ourselves. So we already invited the other inside as sort of the transgression of writing. So my argument would be that yes, writing is already relational. You cannot communicate if you don't somehow communicating with somebody who is not yourself, because then you wouldn't have to communicate. So traditionally speaking, in an academic setting, I would argue that we are encouraged to ignore this relationality and look at writing as a separate package that you do at the end. But if we start looking at writing as something that is hybrid, if we kind of acknowledge this sort of connectivity, then perhaps there are some aspects of writing that we can look at in a different light. So it's not because this is a more truthful way of looking at writing. I don't want to suggest that hybrid writing is the truth. It's more to think of, can the figure of the hybrid or the figure of the monster perhaps help us imagine and rethink the process of writing that acknowledges these sort of connections, that acknowledges the transgressions, that acknowledges the vulnerability, the difficulties. And hybrid is one way of doing it, monstrous is one way of doing it. But obviously there are so many different ways of thinking about it. You could think about queer ways of writing, for example, or weird ways of writing, or whichever kind of lens that might help you think about writing in ways that acknowledges the difficulties inherent to it. Because that would be my argument, that if you teach writing or understand writing as something that's simply supposed to come at the end of your research, it's supposed to just flow from your results and not be a difficulty, then it can become difficult to acknowledge when you do have difficulties, because it's not supposed to be. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can agree about the difficulties, and especially, I was just talking to Agnieszka yesterday, I feel like academic writing is designed to be difficult. The whole I have just finished writing with a friend an article, and we have been writing it, I'm not kidding, for 2 years, writing and rewriting and refining. And at a certain level, this is just the beginning of our journey, because now the reviewers will, wade in, and we will have to probably correct stuff, and we know that we can imagine who is going to be asked to be a reviewer, because if you write about a certain topic and then in Poland, then there's just so many people that they can ask to be a reviewer. So then kind of also your competition. It's very it's very complicated, but I can definitely relate to thinking about certain texts as monsters, because they are not finished and they are very, very tiring. So yeah, that is helpful.
It can be incredibly tiring, yes.
And also the ones that never get finished, never get written, the lost ones, let's say. Or when I think about writing, I mainly just think about what is allowed to be said and what is allowed to be written, because I definitely feel like my imagination is very limited, and I keep discovering what can be written and is okay to be written. And yes, I think I'm definitely very interested in autoethnography and the eye in the research, but I'm as cultural anthropologist, so it's not, you know, it's been present in anthropology for a while. So yeah, it's an interesting, you know, way of writing. I feel it's like between anthropology and being just a writer, just like, you know, somebody who writes about themselves.
If I can add something about ethnography, because I am struggling right now writing my PhD using autoethnography, and I can share with you my experiences from academia, because at least here in Poland, it's still this perception that the knowledge production should be objective, like somehow we are using like objective, of course, in like a special way. And also this perspective of I am also additionally an artist. So the problem is even bigger, because it's like, oh no, this sensitive artist is going to write about her experiences. So it's not the production of knowledge at all. It's just like sharing your experiences. And what came to my mind also listening to Agata, it was like the academic writing should be forcing us to somehow limit our perception, limit our also maybe kind of understanding, because we need to be fitted to some scam, which is pretty present. And scam, yeah. Yeah, to the scam. We are having some kind of preparing academic papers, right? So, for instance, I am facing the problem that when I am writing something, and after that my reviewers are reading it, it's sometimes like you know, the fight between us, because I am pretty sure my experience is pure and it's a kind of truth. And I am not like into changing something just because someone is saying me, you know, the formula is not correct. You are not correct. So your experience is not correct. So that's the problem, because sorry for the sound. It's like yeah, I think that's the problem, that academia is kind of a scam, which is really hardly transformative. And still, there is a question if we are able to do something, taking into account what is going on in like new materialism and this thinking about me, I perspective and being many as well. How to put this kind of thinking into this academic scam. And actually I am really thinking
Czy masz na myśli schemat? Bo ja nie rozumiem. Scam to jest dla mnie oszustwo.
Scam.
Co to jest?
Okay. Yeah, you are right.
Schemat?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
dobra, sorry, that was just, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, maybe it's like my
Okay.
pronunciation. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of problem right now, I would say. And I would like to be more transdisciplinary, but yeah, how to be transdisciplinary, being also all the time hidden in some kind of box. I don't know if we should say it about this box that it's like a black box using Latourian definition, or is just kind of cage. But still, I like even visualization of that is like, yeah, I need to open something. I am trying to do that, but it's still a kind of trouble. Just like comment, not like a question.
Yeah, I believe Marta had a comment as well.
Yeah, and again,
From a slightly different perspective, and it was inspired by what Agatha just said about collaborating along on an academic paper. I'm part of a 3-person team writing on queer translation practices. And we're basing this on our long overdue project of translating Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter into Polish. And about kind of what is the activist queer practice of such a translation of an academic text, of a famously dense and complicated academic text, and a text that is actually commenting on language itself and in ways in which right, gender is inscribed in syntax and grammar and style. And it is an interesting moment of kind of a lot of queer translation theory takes Butler as basis for theorizing. So it's an interesting moment of many meta levels on which you need to work with a very complicated text, trying to very anti-queerly fix what it means and then express it in a different academic language, that of Polish. And the struggle is real. That's just what I wanted to share.
Sounds like it.
And what happens is that the kind of queer practice of this translation is less on a linguistic level. I mean, we're kind of relatively conservative in our language choices in order to make sure that our text is accessible enough in academia, but also outside of academia, so that actual theories of Butler can be used by academics and non-academics in their activist work. But to arrive at this process, it took a long time because we needed to kind of push against the normative academic language and kind of the expectations of that. And on top of that, since we are kind of recalling our experience in an academic essay that is supposed to be published as part of like the big body of translation studies, we need to add on top of that the kind of language of translation theory, but with a queer twist. So the structure is of the straight academic text, but the content needs to be somewhat. So we're kind of not doing what we're preaching in a lot of the things that we attempt. And thank you for your talking about the hybridity of text, because like in a different way kind of accounts for the experiences that we've had with our multiple texts or one hypertext. I don't know, what monster of a text. So thank you for helping me to think about it in that way.
Well, thank you so much for that comment. It sounds like an amazing project, and with so much going on, and it really, I can see the difficulties there of how to acknowledge the queerness, but at the same time pass as a proper academic text. That is like no mean feat.
I recommend reading once we publish. I recommend reading it. It's you know, blood, sweat, and tears, and an interesting take on levels of academic language.
Yeah, super great.
I think it's also a kind of lecture that kind of leaves you kind of speechless, in the sense that you kind of just want to mull it over and think about your own research practices, like, you know, what's happening in the kind of intimacy of your head, right? Which is not really that intimate when you consider all the eyes and people and creatures and ghosts inhabiting it, right? As Lina has shown us. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Line Henriksen again for a wonderful lecture. It was really great having you here in this kind of, you know, in my kitchen, right? In all those other virtual places. Thank you all for participating, and thank you, Lina.
Thank you, Lina.
Thank you for the comments and the questions.